Welcome back to How to Fix Democracy. I'm Andrew Keene, the presenter of all 5 series. For this 5th series, we are focusing on 100 years of American democracy between 1924 and 2024. The first few shows in this 5th series have focused on the 1920s, a unique, remarkable period in American history. And as we move forward, as we move from the 1920s to the 1930s, I thought it would be a good opportunity to talk to a historian who's done a lot of thinking about America in the 1930s, but has a broad enough perspective to understand this transition and what America was like in the 20s and how it changed when it went into the 1930s. Derek Leebaert is our guest today. He's written many books. His latest book, he's a technology executive. He's very broad in his thinking and his interests. His latest book is a book about Franklin Delano Roosevelt and some of his key lieutenants. Derek, welcome to How to Fix Democracy. It's a real honor and a thrill to have you on the show.
Thanks, Andrew.
You haven't written, Derek, any books about the 1920s, but for background, you must have had to understand it to make sense of the FDR years. What's your take on what the 1920s were like in America, particularly in the context of American democracy, its richness or perhaps its absence?
The 1920s were a decade of presidential government under the Republican Party. And the Republican Party of that decade emphasized rugged individualism, as they do today. It was really the hallmark of traditional Americanism in their view. And rugged individualism, however, does not bear up well when hit by a calamitous depression, as occurred in October 1929.
Is that the only generalization one could make about the Republican Party of the 1920s, a rugged individualism? Weren't they in some ways also more liberal, perhaps with a small L, than Democrats, who've always had the specter of race and the South hanging over the party, whereas the Republican Party has always been much more liberal on the issue of race?
Indeed, the Republicans in the 1920s were still remembered as the party of Lincoln. That had been President Abraham Lincoln's political party. It had fought and won the Civil War. But in the 1920s, the party of Lincoln had also turned its back on Black Americans. It was also a decade of mixed prosperity. We recall the boom times of the Roaring '20s. However, the American farm sector was devastated throughout the '20s. That's easily forgotten. Child labor was routine. Segregation, lynch law prevailed in Southern terrorism. So the Roaring '20s, the glamour, the fashion, the speakeasies, that overlaid a lot of what was going wrong with America during those years.
Derek, one of our previous guests on How to Fix Democracy in this series is Amity Shlaes, who is perhaps America's leading authority on Calvin Coolidge, written a magnificent biography of Coolidge. I think she, and I of course I can't speak on her behalf, but I think she may take exception to your analysis of the 20s. She might suggest that offers a view of America in the 20s with 2020 hindsight. No one could have expected the Great Depression and the New Deal that came out of it. and that the ideal of small government worked in the 1920s. And Coolidge, for example, was a successful and popular president. How would you respond to that kind of critique?
It worked well for some, as American democracy often does, then as today. It worked less well for others. So if we do an assessment of the 1920s, let's look at the numbers. Let's look at the farm sector. Let's look at rural America, which at that time was 30% of Americans making their living off the land. Let's look at the mining industries. Let's go case by case by case and see how workers fared in an America that basically prohibited unionization. To be sure, there were labor unions, but you could join a labor union and then you'd be fired. America had a history right into the 1930s of more labor violence than any country in the world. So to regard the 20s as boom times, as particularly standout times of small government, is an idealistic notion that might be misremembering.
One of our other previous guests in this series is Adam Huth, who has written a magnificent book about America during the First World War. I think he would very much agree with your analysis of the problem with unions or the absence of unions. But he might suggest that this didn't come out of the 1920s. It came out of the First World War and the highly repressive state apparatus that emerged in 1917 and 18, which of course took place under a Democratic administration, that of Woodrow Wilson. Would it be fair to say that the reactionary nature of some elements of American democracy that you've talked about already, that was reflected both within the Democratic and the Republican Party?
To be sure, there is a continuing strain through the century that you're examining of ongoing policy issues that can seriously undercut the American ideal, summed up by rugged individualism, or indeed distilled by the notion that the federal government doesn't have responsibility for citizens' vulnerability during peacetime as it does during war. It comes to the ongoing question debated in the United States: what is the role of government? And we ask that in a republic of now 50 states. And John Maynard Keynes, the great economist, asked this as well. Is there a United States of America, or, as he saw in the 1930s, is this an agglomeration of state and regional interests?
Derek, many of the characters who played important roles in the 1930s and onwards emerged in the aftermath of the First World War. J. Edgar Hoover, for example, began his career in that period, and of course began his very ambitious security state building operation as eventually head of the FBI in the 1920s. We take it for granted that the strong centralized American state emerged in the 1930s under FDR. But did the origins, the seeds of the New Deal, can they be discovered in the 1920s?
Sure, or earlier, with the progressive movement and the prairie radicalism of the late 19th century. So many of these passions were there to be built up and to be put to work. Questions of equality between farm workers and industrial workers as far as pay, the ongoing gross injustices of race. So many of these issues arise out of the early 20th century and then come to the fore when America encountered what at that time was called a plague. It was an economic plague, as they called it. The term Great Depression itself did not take hold until about 1933. there was little understanding in Herbert Hoover's administration about the predicament that the United States was in, far more so at that moment than the developed nations of Europe. The Hoover administration, the Secretary of the Treasury, Secretary Mellon, the great banker and industrialist, promised that recovery was right around the corner. And indeed, President Hoover came forth with some federal intervention, but these were loans to the states. These were not grants. And it became too little too late as that economic plague worsened.
Derek, cheer me up a bit. You have a very dark picture of the 1920s, it seems to me, perhaps rightly. But if we were doing this, if we were having, and you may disagree, but if we were having this conversation in 1928, 1927, before, obviously, the Great Depression, before the Wall Street crash, what could we speak about on the front of American democracy that is purely good news? What's the sunny side of the America of the 1920s? Is it cultural innovation? Is it money making? Is it excitement? Is it jazz?
To be sure, but let me first say that my dark view, as you describe it, on the 1920s is merely offered to counterbalance that often far-fetched notion that all was fun and games and the Great Gatsby and F. Scott Fitzgerald and flappers doing the Charleston and so on. That was not the picture of America during
Although to
the
be fair
1920s.
to Fitzgerald, the Gatsby was not a cheerful book.
No, but what a great novel that still remains. And so many of the passions that you and I are discussing right now play out in a book that was published in the early 1920s, the insatiable ambition, status consciousness, the ability to rise from nowhere. And when you look at what is great about America, and arguably what were the benefits of the 1920s, you could see fascinating new industries being birthed in aviation, in automation, skyscrapers getting bigger, dams getting bigger.
Cars, which, excusing the pun, really drove the American economy. I don't know what the numbers were, but some astonishing proportion of the American economy in 1926, 27 was made up of this new automobile industry.
The entertainment industry, radio, movies, so much of this was coming online, and there is much that was good and beautiful about those decades, the 20s and earlier, as there always is in America. But America can be a Janus-faced economy. Out of one side, there can be such richness and abundance as there is today. Yet at the same time, it is easy to overlook the ongoing despair in a society that has a very thin safety net, especially compared to our European friends.
You're an FDR man, Derek. You've just written a book about him. But of course, there was a president who you've touched on between Coolidge, Amity Shlaes Coolidge, and your FDR, which was Herbert Hoover. What is it about Hoover that makes him such an interesting figure today? How do we historicize him in the context of Coolidge, who was very much a 19th century nostalgist, and FDR, of course, who's the father of modern American liberalism?
This is the irony, because Herbert Hoover, above all, was the prototype of the modern man, an orphan who came from nowhere in Iowa, the first class of graduates from a completely obscure, nearly bankrupt institution, Stanford University, and a Stanford degree immediately made him questionable. Yet having a career today that could be compared to that of an elite global management consultant, advising companies on mining industries in China, in Australia, setting up an office and a house of his own in London, and making a vast fortune, having a wife who herself, more so perhaps than her very pragmatic husband, was an intellectual, multilingual, worked as a translator. Herbert Hoover, therefore, was much more of the modern figure than would be Franklin Delano Roosevelt, whose grandfather had made a fortune through the clipper ship sent to China. There was no more improbable character for what occurred during the 1930s than a president named Franklin Delano Roosevelt from the old Dutch aristocracy of the Hudson Valley.
But one more Hoover question. It seems to me, and you know a lot more about this obviously than I do, it seems to me that there wasn't an enormous amount of difference between the political philosophy of Herbert Hoover and Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And for that matter, between the Republican and Democratic parties. Is that fair, or am I making too much, perhaps, of Hoover's faith in government, or perhaps Roosevelt's faith in American capitalism?
FDR would define himself as having saved capitalism. And like today, the progressives in political America of the 1930s, whether they were progressive Democrats or progressive Republicans, were furious at FDR, utterly furious at him for the first term for being so conservative. He did not nationalize the banks, for instance, as many serious people, certainly in the Senate, wanted him to do. He did not nationalize the coal industry, as the utterly bankrupt coal industry begged him to do. Instead, he reminded the coal barons, this is a capitalist country, you go bankrupt, someone will buy you and do a better job. Remember that FDR came in with austerity as his mantra and budget cutting. This was an era before Keynesianism, and it was counterintuitive and made no sense until World War II that the more a government might spend, the faster counter-cyclical effects could raise us out of depression. That's why, Andrew, I'm focusing on FDR's 4 closest associates, the only 4 officials who were in that dozen-year presidency from the very beginning to the very end. And without that group of 4, it would have been extremely difficult for Franklin Roosevelt himself to have accomplished what he did during the 30s and World War II. Those
are The Unlikely Heroes, the title of your new book on FDR's 4 key lieutenants. Historians, Derek, as you know, again, better than I do, they don't like the word inevitable. In fact, if things are inevitable, we don't need historians. But I still need to ask you the FDR inevitable question. Was there something inevitable about FDR? At some point, would the American system have degenerated into such crisis that an FDR character would have been essential? Maybe not in 1930 or 32 or 35 or 38, but at some point the whole thing was going to come crashing down, and there was a need in the 20th century for an FDR character to attempt to merge a modern functional state with American capitalism, market capitalism.
That was a question that was already being asked as the 100 days, the first 100 days of FDR's administration were unfolding exactly 90 years ago. His 4 closest associates were asking themselves, would this have happened anyway without us, or indeed without a Great Depression? Of course, nothing is inevitable, nor was Franklin Roosevelt the inevitable man. There were other contenders in the Democratic Party, Newton Baker, for instance, who also had terrific shots at becoming president in 1932 and being inaugurated under the old calendar in March 4th, Saturday, March 4th, 1933. FDR was no more inevitable to history than, say, Winston Churchill might have been to history. To be sure, both men were catalysts, both men voiced the ebullience to a nation that had been hammered down. But as you observed, it's risky when we say this is an indispensable man, especially in the American system. And that's why wishing on us today, well, we need another New Deal. We need a Franklin Roosevelt leadership. We have to be careful what we wish for, because when we wish for a Franklin Roosevelt leadership, we're asking for larger than life figures to rescue and raise up the rest of poor us. And that's not the way America at its best works.
Those are two very different things, though, wishing for an FDR and wishing for a New Deal. I think my question was more about whether, maybe I didn't phrase it correctly before, but whether or not the New Deal was inevitable, not an FDR who implemented the New Deal. A New Deal which used the state and a new kind of social welfare system to address the deep cyclical crisis of capitalism.
And many of those steps would likely have occurred one way or another, perhaps not so comprehensively, perhaps not so fast, but as American corporations of that era, General Electric, General Motors, Radio Corporation of America, as they got bigger and bigger and bigger, and as workers were exploited more and more and more, indeed, there was bound to be some reaction. These were totally unregulated securities markets on Wall Street. How long could that continue without disaster? There is a way we can think of America in 1933 when Franklin Roosevelt came to office. We commonly spoke about our nation as these United States of America. That was the common term. When he was sworn in on Saturday, March 4th, indeed the prayers down the street in Lafayette Square were Franklin Roosevelt, President of these United States of America. But by 1945, as America was triumphant economically, militarily, that old circumlocution disappeared. It was now the United States of America. And that's the way we have thought of our nation ever since. Not this mishmash of state policies, but far more of a centralized federal government. Let me continue by offering a way to think of the New Deal. The New Deal, which unfolded 90 years ago, is that overarching description of all the programs and reforms and institutions that the Franklin Roosevelt administration launched. The New Deal had nothing to do with collectivism or socialism, as the Republicans and the conservative Democrats kept insisting. The New Deal, in the view of its implementers, was the highest possible order of American individualism, because the New Deal assured that no Americans, ideally, would be left behind because of where they were born, where they had gone to school, the region of the country, their race and national origin. And that, at the top, was what the New Deal pushed for, and that made for far more of an equal playing field.
Is that really true, though, Derek? FDR failed to address the inequities of race in America. His wife, Eleanor, of course, pushed very hard, not just on the issue of African Americans, but also of women. Did the 1930s, the New Deal clearly created the architecture of a social welfare system, but did it change the more profound inequalities of American life, particularly the color inequalities and the gendered ones?
Not at all. And we can see how little has changed today when the headlines that we read are still talking about child labor, for instance, or poor access to health care, or the difficulties of labor organizing. Not to sound dark, as you suggested I was about the 1920s, but there, of course, is a dark underside to the New Deal as well. And historians who confront Franklin Roosevelt and his presidency, by and large, in my view, have done a pretty superficial view at explaining that presidency, especially how it relates to today. The reason for that is because the spotlight has always been on the titanic leader himself. Rarely have historians understood those close associates around him and the role they played in not only executing the New Deal, but in allowing the United States to help win World War II. There are gross undersides to the New Deal, but the historians, and this is true of history in general, initial myths get laid, whether it's about the Cold War, whether it's about the Roosevelt presidency, and the iconic early writings on Franklin Roosevelt in the 1950s, by and large, have been echoed by historians ever since, merely with new anecdotes. Few, if any, historians have taken a fresh look at Franklin Roosevelt and his presidency, and this was the effort of unlikely heroes. And an example of that is we had not known the most basic things about Franklin Roosevelt's presidency. We, of course, know that Franklin Roosevelt himself was grievously crippled, and that's the term of that era, crippled. We neither knew how he led his administration through these four close associates, nor did we know that by no accident at all, each of these four associates were as crippled as was he in their different ways. FDR excelled at identifying strengths and vulnerabilities. He was most comfortable at all, according to Eleanor, with outcasts, and he brought these crippled, injured foursome together to accomplish that saving of democracy during the 30s and victory during World War II.
Saving of democracy, Derek, did he save democracy or did he save American capitalism? Was American democracy in existential crisis in 1930 or 1933 when he came to power?
The prospect of political violence from both the left and the right had already taken hold. It was happening. It was happening for real, not on the scale of 2021 Washington. It was happening for real. In the Midwest, for sure. And there were expectations by serious people of a coup from the right, further rebellion in the agricultural heartland, and there were the terrible examples of Europe at that time. The future was expected by so many of the big thinkers to be communism, fascism, Nazism, collectivism. And for the United States to think that we could have business as usual and remain as we had been until then is a stretch. Something was going to break, and it was breaking bad in 1933.
Derek, FDR was not a shy man. He always, I think his mother told him he would be a great figure in history. Usually great men are products of their mothers of one kind or another. If he is looking down on us now, which perhaps he might be, and he saw what happened in the 1960s and the civil rights movement and the achievements of LBJ, do you think he might have thought to himself, I missed a trick there. I could have done that in the 1930s. I could have not only achieved the New Deal, but I could have righted the greatest wrong in American history, which is the issue of African Americans. Why was he maybe not shy, but you mentioned he was crippled. why did he lack the ambition, the mobility to address this central question about America, this terrible wrong which didn't get righted for another half century?
To understand FDR, one has to grasp his brilliance, which historians don't do, his fluency in French, his understanding of German, his facility in reading Spanish, his ability to have conversations in Dutch, which he prided himself on because of his heritage. The key to understanding FDR is not only the brilliance, which has been overlooked, but the extent of his ruthless self-centeredness. He had empathy, eventually, for the working man and the poor. That was much conveyed by his four associates. But there were fights that FDR saw no political benefit in waging. Among them, the anti-lynching bills, which he never backed. Among them, Jewish immigration fleeing from the Nazis in the late 30s and 1940-41. These were fights that wouldn't benefit him, so why take them on? Historians still today believe that, well, there was no alternative but giving in to the solid South, the former slave states and Confederacy. The belief that it was they who dominated the Democratic Party. FDR had a terrific chance to federalize the extreme terrorism of lynching in the South, just like kidnapping had been federalized in the so-called Lindbergh Bill earlier in the 30s. But FDR didn't need this fight. There was always something more important for FDR than an anti-lynching act. And indeed, if we want to continue this truly disturbing theme of discussion, which is FDR on lynching, that historians have missed entirely, he outright blocked the anti-lynching bill January 1940 that was all set to pass the Senate. It just didn't suit his political interests.
Derek, does this suggest that FDR lacked a heart? And in that sense, was he not really a Democrat? With a small d, not large d.
The person who knew him best, Missy LeHand, who was his close friend of however that gets described, and then during the first two terms, the de facto chief of staff at the White House. Missy LeHand said this was a man incapable of friendship. President Truman, who at the end got to know him pretty well, said this was the iciest man he had ever met. To be sure, FDR had a heart and sympathy. Nobody on the planet was better at lifting you or me up when we ourselves were wounded, when we might have had a child killed in combat, when we would be crippled by accident ourselves. He would be superb in raising us up, as he did a crippled nation. But as far as FDR having friends, as far as his believing that he had any peers anywhere, that would be a stretch. How that transformed to politics.
His great critics, of course, suggested that he wasn't a Democrat and that he was actually in the business of dismantling democracy. Their exhibit A for that argument is his attempt, in their language, to institute some sort of coup with respect to the Supreme Court. What's your take on that criticism of Roosevelt, his attempt to, in some ways, orchestrate a coup from above, undermining the core tenets of American democracy?
Well, the critics could find far better examples than expanding the Supreme Court, which by and large should have been expanded, and to which he did exceed at expanding. Congress, by April 1937, had agreed, yes, you can have 2 additional justices, but he wanted more, so he didn't compromise. John Maynard Keynes addressed the issue of court expansion. Are we going to have this antediluvian, medieval Supreme Court that will cut off all efforts at federal authority? So the court example is not the best to cite for FDR's authoritarian hand. if I were going to make a case about FDR the authoritarian, it would be his use of tax records at the Department of the Treasury to go after any enemy. It would be his internment, as is well known, of 126,000 Japanese Americans, many of whom were citizens during World War II. And his final stretch at authoritarian power occurred at the end of World War II and has been completely overlooked by historians. And that's when he wanted to put in place a so-called National Service Act that would allow him to draft civilians of any age, men and women. The government would draft them and put them into allotted jobs. It was not needed by 1944 and 1945 at all, but it was FDR's attempt to break the power of the labor unions and to extend a very, very heavy hand on American life.
When we look back, Derek, many people, particularly progressives on the left in America in 2024, believe that the New Deal can be resurrected, just as it was unstitched in the neoliberal period by Ronald Reagan, by Richard Nixon, even by Democrats like Bill Clinton. Should we look back at FDR's New Deal with a degree of nostalgia, thinking that we can recreate it? Or is it something unique in history that can never be reestablished?
Well, each historical moment has its finite life. But the issues that America was confronting in the 1930s still endure. Progressives would argue that the fight is not over. Indeed, a fascinating activist group in American public policy today is known as the Descendants. Jim Roosevelt, Henry Wallace, Harold Ickes Jr., Junes Hopkins, and Tom Perkins Coggeshall. These are the descendants of FDR and of his four closest lieutenants who came together to indeed continue the fight for these New Deal issues. Let's not think of them as New Deal, perhaps, but yeah, child labor, the advantages of being able to organize unions, minimal wage, equal access to health care. This is a fight that hasn't stopped since the 1930s, let alone civil rights. So these ideals that could be summarized at its best by the New Deal are still with us and are still worth pushing for.
Thank you, Derek. That was a panoramic conversation about a panoramic period and a panoramic man. A real pleasure to have you on How to Fix Democracy. Thank you so much.
I'm glad to be here, Andrew.